All right, hey guys. So we're going to read chapter 1 of An Indigenous People's History of the United States for Young People by Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz. So, chapter 1, Follow the Corn. History books often refer to the New World to talk about the lands now called North and South America. That term reflects a European perspective. That part of the world was not new to the people who had lived there for thousands of years when the Europeans arrived. It was home. Human societies originated in sub-Saharan Africa about 200,000 years ago. The people began migrating out from Africa and around the globe. Around 15,000 years ago, they began to occupy 7 areas. 3 of the 7 areas were on the land masses that are currently called the Americas. They are the Valley of Mexico and Central America, sometimes called Mesoamerica, the South Central Andes in South America, and Eastern North America. By around 8500 BCE, societies in all 7 areas of settlement were domesticating and cultivating plants. In the Americas, the most important plant the indigenous peoples grew was maize, or corn. Corn, a sacred food. Prior to 1492, corn did not exist outside the Americas. Scientists have evidence that indigenous peoples in central Mexico cultivated corn 10,000 years ago, around 8000 BCE. 12 to 14 centuries later, 6800 to 66 BCE, corn production had spread from the Central Valley south to the tip of South America, north to the subarctic, and to both coasts of the 2 continents. This proliferation of corn and other crops, such as beans, squash, and potatoes, required vast networks of cultural and commercial exchange among the peoples of North, Central, and South America. Thousands of years ago, indigenous scientists turned a wild grain into a food source that sustained their bodies and their spiritual lives. Unlike other grains, corn cannot grow wild. Without attentive care from indigenous peoples, it would not exist. The people of Central America cultivated corn in many colors. It was even grown in deserts and other areas that were very dry. Growing it there required complex irrigation systems. By the end of the 1500s CE, the total population of what we now call the Western Hemisphere was about 100 million people. Approximately 40 million were in North America and Mexico. Central Mexico alone supported some 30 million people. For comparison, at that time, the population of all Europe extending to the Ural Mountains and eastern Russia was about 70 million. Scientists attribute the significantly larger population in the Americas to a relatively disease-free society whose use of herbal medicine, surgery, dentistry, and hygienic and ritual bathing kept disease at bay. Let's take a look at people and corn in the area that is now Mexico and Central America. The origins of corn in Mexico and Central America. What we know today as Mexico and Central America are vast areas of land where many different nations of people lived and have lived for thousands of years. You can probably remember hearing about the Mayans and the Aztecs. But throughout the history of that region, peoples of many distinct nations were living side by side, sometimes trading with each other, sometimes at war with each other, sometimes absorbing or conquering one another. In addition to the Mayan and Aztec civilizations, the Olmec, Toltec, and Colua peoples thrived in the Mesoamerica at different times. So did others, such as the Tepanec, Texcoco, and Tlacopan. Some of these peoples conquered others, many then conquered by the Aztecs who had migrated from the northern Mexico. Conquered or conqueror, they all had one thing in common: they cultivated corn. The first great cultivators of corn were the Mayans. Their civilization was initially centered in what is now northern Guatemala and in Tabasco, a state in present-day Mexico. In fact, cultivation of corn was at the core of Mayan culture. Their religion centered around this vital food. The Mayans of the 10th century CE built city-states so far south as Belize and Honduras. Today, those who study Mayan cultures are astonished by their art, architecture, sculpture, and painting, and their understandings of time and mathematics. By 36 BCE, they had developed the concept of zero and sophisticated calendar systems. They studied the movements of the moon and planets and predicted eclipses. The Mayan people were governed by a system in which the priesthood and the nobility shared the power to make and enforce laws that affected all of the Mayan society. War, prisoners, criminals, debtors, and orphans could be forced into labor. Mayans who lived away from the cities worked the nobles' fields and paid rent to use the land for their own needs. Their labor and their taxes helped to build roads, temples, nobles, houses, and other structures. We do not know if they were content with this arrangement or if they felt exploited. Mayan dominance of the region lasted more than 500 years. Eventually, dissension and uprisings led to the collapse of the Mayan state. The end of their political power in the region did not mean the end of the Mayans themselves. Contemporary Mayan people live today throughout the lands of their ancestors. At the same time that Mayan civilization was developing, the Olmecs, sometimes called Mexico's mother culture, flourished in the Valley of Mexico. The Toltec, Colua, and Teutonic cultures subsequently dominated and sometimes struggled for dominance in that region. Meanwhile, the Aztecs extended their influence in the valley and eventually consolidated their power. By 1426 CE, they and their allies had overthrown the Tepancs, and they soon moved to bring all the peoples of Mexico under their authority. The economic basis for the powerful Aztec state was hydraulic agriculture. Corn was their most important crop, but beans, pumpkins, tomatoes, cocoa, and other food crops flourished and supported the dense population. They also grew tobacco and cotton. Weaving and metalwork were valued as works of art. Along with the crops, they were useful commodities in the marketplaces of each city in the trade networks initially established by the Toltecs. These networks reached into what we know today as the southwest and west coast of the United States. Turquoise, macaw, and parrot feathers, seashells, obsidian, flint, and animal hides were among the many items traded among all of the peoples who were part of this trade network. The Aztecs flourished culturally, economically, militarily, and politically, but they faced growing rebellion by the peoples from whom they exacted tribute. Tribute is a payment of some kind that a ruler demands of peoples who have been conquered. The Aztecs required tribute in the form of military service, physical labor, crops, and manufactured products. The Spanish conquistador Cortés recruited the rebels as allies, making it possible for the Spanish to crush Mexico and level its cities in a 3-year genocidal war. Though the Aztecs lost control of Mexico, like the Mayans, their descendants are part of today's societies in Mexico and the U.S. Let's turn now to corn in the area of the continent that we know today as the United States. Corn in the north. The area known today as the southwestern United States was once the northern periphery of the Aztec Empire. Most of it is a fragile land base where the elevation is high, rainfall is scarce, and drought is a part of life. And yet, by 2100 BCE, the Hohokam peoples of that area had traded for and were cultivating corn, beans, squash, and cotton. Among their descendants are the Akimel Odaham. They built one of the most extensive networks of irrigation canals in the world at the time. The largest canals were 75 to 80 feet across and 20 feet deep. Many of them were lined with clay, which made them leak-proof. A single canal system could carry enough water to irrigate an estimated 10,000 acres. From the Atlantic Ocean to the Mississippi River, and south from the Great Lakes to the Gulf of Mexico, was one of the most fertile agricultural belts in the world. In the 12th century CE, the Mississippi Valley region was home to several large city-states that were built of earthen stepped pyramids like those in Mexico. The largest of these was the Cahokia. Cahokia supported a population of tens of thousands, larger than that of London during the same time period. The scale of their constructions and their agriculture infrastructure required sophisticated civic and social organization. One of the mounds at Cahokia is believed to be the largest earthwork in the Americas to have been built before the European invasions. The people of these mound builder civilizations dispersed from the European invasion, but we know their descendants today as the Cherokee, Chickasaw, Choctaw, Muskogee Creek, and Natchez nations of the southeast. These tribes retain some of the political complexity of the Cahokian culture. Their tribal governments had three branches: a civil administration, a military, and a branch that dealt with the sacred. Autonomous tribal towns made decisions about trade and relations with other groups, but in some political and social matters, the towns worked together as a confederacy to make decisions that affected all their members. These southeastern peoples and their descendants today maintain important traditions related to corn, such as green corn ceremonies. The Haudenosaunee Confederacy, sometimes referred to as the Six Nations of the Iroquois Confederacy, developed in what is now the northeastern part of the United States. It was made up of the Seneca, Cayuga, Onondaga, Oneida, and Mohawk nations, and was later joined by the Tuscaroras. This confederacy incorporated six widely dispersed nations comprising thousands of agricultural villages and hunting grounds in what are currently known as New York, Pennsylvania, and Quebec. By collective stewardship of the land and a clan village system of democracy, it avoided giving all the political control and decision-making to a single group. Corn, their staple crop, was stored in granaries and distributed equitably by clan mothers, the oldest women from each extended family. In this confederacy, the clan mothers also played a key role in governance. They chose the men who would represent their clans in the governing councils, and they held the power to recall unsatisfactory representatives. They also had the right to speak to the council. The Haudenosaunee people today retain a fully functioning confederacy, similar to what they had before European arrival. The Haudenosaunee Constitution, called the Great Law of Peace, inspired some key parts of the U.S. Constitution. No matter where they were, Indigenous peoples' governance was based on valuing what was best for the community over the needs or preferences of individuals. Stewards of the land. Indigenous peoples sustained their populations not only by adapting to their specific natural environments, but also by changing their environments to meet their need. This is regarded as stewardship, or being stewards of the land. A steward is someone who is responsible for the purposeful, careful management of resources so that the needs of a group can be met, both in the present and in the future. Someone who exploits the resources for gain only in the present, leaving them ruined for future use, would not be considered a steward. By the time the European invasions began, Indigenous peoples had occupied and made changes to every part of the Americas. Let's take a quick look at two of the ways Indigenous peoples managed their land and resources prior to the European invasion. We will specifically consider the use of fire for agriculture and game management, and the creation of roadways that span the continent. One main tool for shaping nature was fire. Indigenous communities regularly used fire in multiple ways that changed the pre-colonial North American landscape. For example, indigenous farmers of the Northeast always carried flints to start fires as needed. Such controlled fires helped to clear space in the forests for growing corn and other crops. Instead of the densely wooded wilderness Europeans depicted in literature and art, the real American landscape included cornfields, berry patches, and groves of nut trees that contributed to the food supply. They used fire to clear space for other purposes too. Most indigenous peoples of the Americas, unlike the people of Europe, Africa, and Asia, did not domesticate animals for a ready supply of hides and meat. Instead, they created havens to attract elk, deer, bear, and other game for hunting. One strategy for doing this was to burn the undergrowth in forests. In the following springtime, animals were drawn to the young plants that sprouted. Hunters killed what the community needed to replenish supplies of meat and hides. The indigenous peoples who lived in the Great Plains also used fire to extend those vast grasslands to make more grazing lands for buffalo herds. With parts of the forest cleared by fire, the herds could roam the east. Native peoples also left an incredible imprint on the land, with systems of roads that tied their nations and communities together across the entire landmass of the Americas. These were not just hunting paths that followed game trails or routes that peoples could easily follow during seasonal migrations. They are well-traveled roads that tracked major rivers like the Mississippi, Ohio, Missouri, Columbia, Colorado, and the Rio Grande. Some followed seacoast. One ran along the Pacific coast from an urban area in western Mexico all the way to northern Alaska. A branch of that road ran through the Sonoran Desert up onto the Colorado Plateau. From the Pueblo communities of the Southwest, travelers took roads eastward onto the Semirad Plains along tributaries of the Pecos River. Other roads led from the northern Rio Grande to the southern plains of what is now western Oklahoma by the way of the Canadian and Cimarron rivers. The routes along those waterways led to others that followed rivers from the southeast and connected with roads that turned southward toward the Valley of Mexico. From Muskogee Creek, towns in present-day Georgia and Alabama, travelers could take a road north through Cherokee lands and over the eastern mountains to where the Ohio and Scotia rivers met. From there, they would eventually reach the west coast on a route that followed the Ohio, Mississippi, and Missouri rivers, crossed Rocky Mountains and met the Columbia River Road. Going even further, they could reach the large population center at the river's mouth and connect with the Pacific Coast Road. When Europeans had arrived on this continent, they often seemed unaware that many conditions that were useful to them were the result of indigenous people's stewardship of the land. Some early settlers remarked that in many places they could easily have driven carriages between the trees. Others commented about large clearings in the forest, some with the well-tended gardens and cornfields. They did not seem to recognize that for thousands of years, native people had been making roads and clearing spaces to make trading, hunting, and agriculture easier. Willfully or not, they depicted the land as empty, devoid of civilized peoples, and theirs for the taking. North America in 1492 was not a virgin wilderness. It was a network of indigenous nations, a network of peoples of the corn. The link between peoples of the North and South can be seen in the diffusion of corn from Mesoamerica along routes created by the people and used for millennia. Both Muskogees and Cherokees, for example, whose original homelands in North America are located in the southeast, trace their lineage to migration from or through Mexico. Cherokee historian Emmett Starr, who uses the spelling Muskogee, wrote, "The Cherokees most probably preceded by several hundred years the Muskogees in their exodus from Mexico and swung in a wider circle, crossing the Mississippi River many miles north of the mouth of the Missouri River, as indicated by the mounds. The Muskogees were probably driven out of Mexico by the Aztecs, Toltecs, or some other of the northwestern tribal invasions of the 9th or preceding centuries. This is evidenced by the customs and devices that were long retained by the Creeks. Traditions related to corn are practiced throughout the indigenous agricultural areas of North America. Some elements are similar to those of the Valley of Mexico, although these practices vary from one community to the next. At the core of each dance, of each song, of each prayer is a commemoration of the gift of corn. The peoples of the corn remain connected in spite of the heavy influences of colonialism. This brief overview of pre-colonial North America counteracts the settler colonial myth of the wandering Neolithic hunter in vast unused and uncharted lands, and indigenous civilizations were based on advanced agriculture and well-developed systems of governance. It is essential to understand the complex interrelationships indigenous peoples had before European invasions. It is also essential to understand that those relationships have evolved in ways that continue to bring Indigenous people from around the world to protect key resources from exploitation. In 2016 and 2017, Indigenous people from 6 continents came together to resist construction of a pipeline that endangered water resources. They took a stand as stewards of the land, supporting each other's struggles into the 21st century. They stood together at Standing Rock.